Hello and welcome to another edition and episode of Veterans for Success, the podcast where I get to chat with and interview seemingly ordinary people with extraordinary stories. Right. So today I have Kevin Wright with me. Hello, Kevin. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, good morning, Joe.
Fantastic to have you with me. So, you know the score. We've had a good chat about how this works, and there's no big introduction into your skills and knowledge and experience, which is vast. I know, but what we do is we do a steady reveal as we go along, and let's get to know you a little bit better. So tell me a little bit about your time before the military, going back to your childhood. What was that like, to give the listener a flavour for where you're at and what makes you who you are?
Yeah, we were chatting about this really. When you look back on things, because it's your normal, it's only later on when you look at stuff. I mean, I grew up in what was, I suppose, by today's standards, quite a poor working class family. My parents were quite young. I was born, 50s. So at the time, post-war, it was quite a tough period. So I grew up in a council house that they managed to get when they were quite young. My dad was a typesetter, would work nights, and he was a grafter. So that they were, of the time, a typical working class young couple that had kids very young. And they sort of crafted a world around that, and they worked really hard and did their best, really. And I was fortunate in as far as my mum spent a lot of time really not educating me, but teaching me, and she encouraged me to read. So she was provide prolific sort of guidance on reading and learning through reading, which is really what I did. And I suppose, cut a long story short, that sort of went a bit pear-shaped when she got cancer. I suppose I was about 8. And at the time, whilst cancer's still challenging, getting cancer at that period was brutal, really, in terms of what they would do or what the interventions would do. So imagining, I guess, at the time, they must have been late 20s, the pair of them. And that came along, and then everything sort of went into a sort of tailspin, I suppose. And ultimately, I was fortunate, again, these moments that you get in life that give you this 2-degree shift, this one little thing that happens that ends up making a huge impact. And I passed my 11 plus, which existed at the time, which provided me a route, if you like, through education that otherwise wouldn't have been available to me. I mean, at the time, I was fortunate enough to get to a grammar school that probably in its way it's operated, and how it saw itself, it was a free grammar school, so it sort of sat alongside an independent public school. So I was incredibly fortunate that happened, because my mum died when I was 14. Yeah, I think actually the night before my 15th birthday.
So I mean, that must have, I know in the space of a couple of minutes you've put what 7 years together in a few minutes. I mean that, and your mother was in her 20s when she contracted cancer, and she was giving you and your brother, because you had a brother, massive guidance. And that must have been a really tough period, if you can remember that, really.
Yeah, I mean, we all carry, I mean, we've all got our experiences, and we've all got, I don't want to, but we've all got our stories, and I'm not diminishing that. We've all got stories, and when we get on talking about military, we've all got stories, because I believe anybody ever sort of just ends up in the military, and certainly some of the things we're going to talk about, because they come from a happy, well-rounded, balanced background, and my experience in the military had always been, bringing together a people, and a family community bit of that was a massive, particularly in the Navy, where that community essence of felt sense of family was so important. So to your point, everything in the world, and we're going to talk about this later when we start thinking about
Yeah,
mindset,
of course we are, yeah.
but everything in the world starts there, and the foundations that we have and the people around us start to shape how that
Mm,
works. So
mm,
our felt senses, our stories are just as real. I could probably say to you, it's as real now as it was then, because the felt sense of that emotion is
mm,
immediate. So yeah, it was brutal actually. Everything in the world just suddenly fell away, and my dad was working nights, and my brother and I were sort of shunted around from grandparents to stay here. We were still going to school, and it just became our normal in a way.
yeah,
And then obviously when all this happened and she died, because it it shapes you as different, right? Because there's no shared commonality with your mates or school or anybody else, because you've got no idea what it must be like. So you already start to sort of get this felt sense of being in a different space to everybody else,
yeah,
and that becomes your normal. So it was pretty brutal, but we had to adapt and sort of overcome. And just happened that the toolbox we were trying to use to adapt and overcome, we sort of made up, frankly, me and my brother. What we thought people were like, or what we thought emotions were like, or what we thought. So that's sort of how we did it. But yeah, it's for anybody, as you go through life, you start to talk to other folk that have had experiences or lost their partners and have been left with kids, having to try and help them navigate that. Even with all the assets available now, that is massively challenging for any parent.
mm,
Back in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't exactly as evolved and as insightful as it is now. So in a way, there wasn't anything. There was no support. There was no guidance. It was just sort of left. And that whole, man up and get on with it, which again, coming from the East End, which was, and again, post-war, that was the mentality. You just chin it out, get up, get on with it,
yeah,
and you move forward. And that's essentially what we did. We just got up and got on with it. But yeah, it's still, even now, if we talk about it, it's still a sort of pivotal moment of that, because I
mm,
still felt sense is still exactly the same as it probably was.
yeah. And I always reflect on the past and say to clients, your past is what makes you who you are today. It all contributes in its own little way to who you are now.
Yeah, all these things, isn't it? It's about the tapestry of our experiences that
Mm,
shape. Um, and I know you talk about clients, but when I've worked with folk, um, it's a result. What it is the very experiences and things that get you to here, to where we are now
yeah,
today. What it doesn't do is define where you go from here.
no,
It's simply the things and shapes and experiences that get you to this point, and then where you go with it is always, that's always open. There's always opportunity.
yeah,
Doesn't matter what, but it's simply all the combinations of things you've experienced that have just got you to this point.
yeah. And it's like the SH1T happens, and it's what you do with it when it happens, because it's going to happen, that determines your future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the military bit of it in a second. And I'll talk about it a bit later on. The only control you have in life is what you do. You can't
Mm,
control events. You can't control cancer. You can't control what happens to people you care about. The actions are the ground on which you stand. And what I've learned is that as much as you say, well, I've got control of what's going on around me, it's in what you do that can have an impact on what's going on around
yeah,
you. And it's the
yeah.
choices that you make about it. So that consistently in context of the military stuff is so core, because it's about how you conduct and how you react to circumstance that determines the outcome,
Mm,
uh, and how the people around you react and respond to circumstance. Because we get sold this sense, or some of us do, that there's some special blackboard that there's a formula for success, and all you've got to do is do this plus this plus this plus this equals success, and it's just one sort of progression of moving on from one success to another, to a blackboard. And of course, that doesn't exist. That's
No.
not true, because what it is life is a series of storms, to use a sea sort of simile. And that's what life is, and it's in the storms where the growth happens. It's in the storms where we learn the difference between what's great and what isn't, where these contrasts are. And it's from that point that we move forward. And that's where the grist is. That's where we grow and get better. And as you said, when it hits the fan, that's the tester, not when it's all going great.
No, and thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. And I just want to take you back, not to dwell on it for too long, but the pivotal time, the day before your 15th birthday, when your mum sadly passed away, and your dad, because we had a conversation, your dad was a typesetter, a mathematical genius, and spending a lot of time at work, and then you were moved around between relatives and your nan and your granddad. And your granddad played a big part, didn't he, in your life? It'd be fair to say, your grandparents.
Yeah. I mean, you sort of, again, the glue that binds us, as much as the sort of that family unit element of my mum and dad got fractured, I was also lucky because at the time I was in a family environment of community that still had that sort of uncle, aunt, grandparents, heritage, story, narrative, that sort of mini tribe thing that came out of London. And therefore, at that point, they sort of came together to provide that support that my dad couldn't. So again, I was fortunate, and my granddad on both sides, obviously because of the wars. And when you look at it now, we talk about that as past history, but when I was growing up, it wasn't, because it was visceral, still there. And they'd come out of two major conflicts, both sides of them, that had been only separated by what? I mean, 1920 to 39, by barely 19 years.
Yeah.
So my great granddad had served in the Navy as a stoker, worked his way up to chief stoker, had fought at Jutland, and was back in again for the Second World War. And my other granddad was in the Air Force, much the same thing. But the Navy sort of thing as a story was part of our sort of family narrative, I suppose. And it was something I was aware of growing up, and I'd read books and was able to sort of, I suppose, escape into it. So it was always there, really, as a thing.
And then there came a bit of a crescendo between the relationship with your father, and what prompted you to, if that's a polite way of putting it, I suppose. The crescendo that happened, and what did it cause you to do with your military objectives, if you like?
Well, I suppose it was quite simple, really. I mean, again, as you get older, I don't know about you, Joe, really, but we're quite harsh on our parents early on, because we sort of think they're these sort of demigods that know everything, and we're in conflict with them. Because as you grow through life, you realise they're just human beings, and at the end of the day, while you can't necessarily forgive them for their how can I put this, less than empathetic parenting skills, you sort of eventually develop a compassion for them, because you sort of understand where they came from, or understand the toolbox they had to work with. So, but at the time, I I decided I wanted to be a theatrical designer, really. So I was followed the conventional sort of do well thing, because unfortunately I was really good at sport. And anybody that's been in a sort of public schoolish type environment, or better still in the military, if you can play sport and you're good at it,
You sorted.
it's a bit of a blue card, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
So I was forgiven my reluctance to study Latin and all the other rubbish, because I was rugby captain. I'd got myself to a point of fencing where I was on the Olympic training squad, and I got voted. It was the first year in the school, I think, they decided to go egalitarian and vote for the head boy. Um, and I got voted head boy, which I think put the headmaster as near to a cardiac arrest as I've ever seen anybody. But then there I was. So I guess he thought, my dad thought in his head, that was it. Barrister sorted out of the pits of the East End, generation, whatever. And that was his view. And I had a different view, and I wanted to be an artist. And I'd got myself to l'Opera in Paris. I was going to Wimbledon. I had some great mentors. We'll talk about that a bit later, about how the influence of mentors make a huge difference on your life. And I thought I was set. I got myself to National Youth Theatre with my designs, and it took 4 people here, and I was banging. I thought, this is good. And then, of course, met the impassable mindset of a working class Londoner that wasn't really having any of it. It was quite adamant that if I did that, I'd be cut off, and that would be the end of it.
Right.
So, of course, I thought, right, well, nobody's going to control me. So, where
Yeah,
can
and I suppose looking at it in a sort of ironic way, if that's the right term, your dad was a typesetter, genius mathematically, and then he wanted you to be a barrister because maybe that was his idea of the perfect world or an upgrade from a typesetter, and yet you weren't seeing that, were you?
No, not really. No, I suppose that set the agenda really of what we're going to go on to talk about, which is I thought, no, I don't really care what you think about what you think I should be doing. And then I just sat and thought, well, he's not going to support me. I was 18, I suppose, I'd done my A-levels. So it was obvious I was going to have to go and do something. Didn't want to go to uni. The college had been blown out. So everything I thought I was going to do, go to France, work with some of the best designers, had gone. I thought, well, what can I do that, one, will feed me, two, I can sort of do things I really love doing, because as you know, at the time there wasn't the opportunity to be a Red Bull extreme athlete or make a
No.
living. So that wasn't open. And really the only place you could actually go and fall out of airplanes and play sport and do exciting things was the military. Um, and I thought, well, if I can do that and get in, they'll also feed me, and they'll also give me somewhere to live. So that was a three score as far as I was concerned. So I just simply got on the train, went to Holborn to the recruiting office, and walked through the door. And they said, what do you want? So I want to join the Navy, please. And then they asked me what quals I had, and I told them. They said, well, you're in the wrong door. You need to go around the corner into the officer bit. And that was the sort of first steps, I suppose, onto the military path.
Very good.
Yeah.
So how long did that process take, and what was your, not that it concerned you at all, what was your dad's view on that?
I think it just bemused him so much, it almost put him into a brain freeze, and then eventually decided it was his idea. Bizarre. Okay, great, well done. So we all calmed down a bit. I went and got a job in a men's clothing shop, I think, assuming I was only going to be there for a little bit, and for reasons we could debate anyway. The entry level I went in on was to be a helicopter pilot, because I thought that was pretty cool. So I started that process, went back, waited for my flying aptitude stuff, which was still pretty conventional, I suppose, at Biggin Hill. Went, no, actually, what happened was I was working. I was back in the clothes shop for about 3 months, and I thought there's something gone wrong here because I haven't heard anything. And there was no internet, obviously. So I had to ring them up eventually and go, I think I should have been hearing something. And it turns out my application got lost, delayed, whatever. So I think by the time I got to Biggin Hill was about 5 months after I'd first walked through the door. And I went through all the, Biggles upside down, put this dot in the middle of this and flying things because it was going to be fixed wing, I think. And I was quite good at it, but my maths was rubbish. So they said, well, very good, but you're going to have to go back and get your maths sorted out. We'll have you as a pilot, but you need to go and get your maths. I said, what does that involve? They said, well, go back. I can't remember what it was, A level, whatever. Do a bit on that and then come back again. I said, you know what? No, I've had enough. When is the earliest I can join the Navy, please? And they said, doing what? I said, I really don't care. Just what? How quickly can I get to Dartmouth? And they said, well, there's a general seaman officers course starts in January. And I think this was November. I said, all right, I'll take it. I'll go. And that's how I ended up coming in as a general seaman. So I think I walked through the gates of Dartmouth in the dark on the 6th of January, 76, which was 6 days before my 19th birthday. And
Very
then
good.
that,
And how did that feel then when you walked through the gate?
um, I felt like I was coming home, really, frankly. I mean, because, all right, you've got to put up with a lot of people shouting at you, but that's the game. And you've got to turn up and do things because that's the game. And as long as you turn up and do things in the game with enthusiasm, then you sort of get on, don't you?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then go and play rugby or let you go and fall out of helicopters or go sit on boats. I mean, it seemed like a reasonable trade-off to me. I mean, I was still sort of not particularly excited about academics, but the rest of it, I thought, yeah, I love this really. I found it all quite amusing. I thought the colour sergeants on the parade ground were highly amusing. I thought the whole thing was just brilliant.
Yeah, I remember we got together and someone said to me once, when the drill sergeant is shouting, screaming at you, just imagine him with no clothes on or something, or just imagine him just being in a compromised position, which meant that he wasn't as powerful as he thought he was. Do anything to deflect that power, if you like.
Well, let's go back to what we said about local. I don't know if we talked about local control, how much power you think you've got over ththings.
Mm.
I learned early on, the only power I had over things was how I reacted to all this nonsense. So I
Yeah,
saw what
yeah, yeah.
happened when people didn't react well. I thought, well, that's not going to be good. So rocking up, smiling, and just taking it on the chin, whatever, on the assumption they weren't going to kill me, which I thought might have been a bit of a problem for them, filling out the paperwork. So I thought, well, they're not going to kill me. So I assume there's going to be an end to this nonsense at some point. So all I've got to do is chin it out for a bit. And it sort of worked, really. I mean, I genuinely respected them. I thought what they did, their experiences, what they were trying to do. And we talk about this a bit later on about, mentoring and things like that. That was the start of my learning about the
Yeah.
value of, particularly senior rates and senior sergeants and what position they occupied in this hierarchy, because that's what it was then, and the fundamental value of that, and the learning resources that they brought. Because yeah, that there's some odd people, let's put it that way, banging around,
Yeah.
but for the most part, I mean, especially like at that time, the majority of the drill sergeants were gunnery, um, and Marines at Dartmouth.
Yeah.
So they'd had just incredible experiences, and they were some of the best in the world.
Mm.
So you learn, don't you? You just
Yeah.
sort of
Well,
assimilate.
I remember when we actually passed out and we had the passing out parade and then the drinks afterwards. Our staff were absolutely brilliant, the directive staff. Once you got to know them as people, and the knowledge that they had was just phenomenal. And just to be, as you say, we're going to come on to mentorship later, just to have them as coaching you and mentoring you over the period of time while you're in your basic training was fabulous.
Yeah, and it's always about the choices you make and the mindset you approach it with. In the end, doesn't matter, does it? It's just consistent, and it. I just loved it, and because of that, I didn't have to think about anything else. I just got on with the things I was good at. Learn, when I screwed up, which I did a lot, is just take it on the chin and then not do that again, and just keep stepping my way through it, really.
Yeah.
And I loved it. I genuinely loved it. I couldn't think of anything better at that time in my life. I thought this is where I want to be. This is my home.
So that was the late 70s. You went through your officer training. Where did you go to? What was your first posting after your
Well, after they'd finished biffing me around as a midshipman,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, my first actual proper job was a frigate. Uh, and again, these confluences that happen, it was at a time when it was the last vestiges of that period of the Navy where they still had bases all over the world, and we were still sort of going through the motions of having an influence, I suppose, West Indies, Far East, Singapore. So it was that last sort of sunset, and I was in the Navy just at that period on those types of ships. So I got sent, I think the first ship I joined went to the West Indies. I was away for nearly a year, came back, did some other courses, then went to the Far East on another frigate. So that period I spent mostly there. I mean, we're going to talk about the sort of career choices, but it was during that first period as a midshipman, funnily enough, you get this book given to you, which is like a task book. And as a midshipman, you don't exist anywhere really. You're not. Nobody on the lower deck will trust you to do anything because you're not a proper officer. And of course, everybody else on the ship is proper officers, and you're just a thing that exists to sort of just do shitty things and learn a lot. And they give you a book to do it. So I was on this thing for a year, and as part of that task book, um, along with all the other things you had to go and get signed off, somebody decided that I would do what was called the Ship's Divers Aptitude course when I was in Gibraltar.
Oh, lovely
And
place, Gibraltar. Yeah.
yeah, at different times, still had the last of the Navy rum in a big locker somewhere they were selling off. So yeah, happy days, except for a midshipman in Gibraltar. It was a bit rubbish, to be honest. Anyway, I got sent to this thing, got shouted at, was made to put on a rubber suit with some ridiculous neck ring that you had to enter through the thing on it, put boots on, put a load of gear on, get in the water on the end of a rope, walk about a bit, come back up again, get shouted at, jump off things, get shouted at. Once you'd been shouted at a bit, then they put a hood over your head and sent you back down again in the pitch black. Overall, not a pleasant experience. And I just, right, get it out of the way, get it out of the
Well,
way.
yeah, I remember doing diving in the army, and we didn't need a black hood over us. I mean, you were in Gibraltar, right? So we were in Portsmouth. So as soon as you touched the bottom of the water, that was it. It was just black anyway.
Yeah, there's a dock called KG5 dock in Portsmouth. I don't know if that's when they did it in, but
Yeah,
literally you drop into that, and that was deliberate in the training thing. They had a jack stay, an underwater line from one side of the dock to the other. And
yeah,
you're right, once you hit it, and it was just sludge, and you had no idea what was in said sludge, and you had no way of seeing what you were doing. So you were using the diver's eyes, wasn't it? Your fingers
yeah,
trawling through it. But that's why in Jib they put this hood over your head because they thought nil vis. Everything was nil vis
yeah.
and cold. And they couldn't make it any colder, so they just put hoods over it. Anyway, long story short, I thought that was it, done, finished. That was the end of it. And I thought ticked off and didn't think any more of it. And then got got my first appointment after all that nonsense, passed my fleet board. So this must have been 6 months later. And I got the first proper ship we're talking about, which is HMS Stiller, I think, which is still a traditional gun frigate. I thought that's exciting. And they told me what I was going as captain's correspondence officer. That was quite exciting. And it said HMS Stiller by way of HMS Vernon on my letter. And I looked at it. I thought, I don't know what Vernon is. And I looked it up, and it was the heading of it was the Torpedo and Anti-Submarine Training School. Right. So I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And the subheading was Royal Navy Diving School. And I thought, no, this must be a mistake. And I rang up my appointer and said, look, I seem to be going via HMS Vernon. I'm not quite sure why. And they said, well, not only have you got these other duties on Scylla, you're going as ship's diving officer. I said, why? Why? Because they need a ship's diving officer, and you passed the aptitude test, so you join Vernon for 4 weeks ship's diving officer course on such and such and such and such a day. So before I joined the first ship, I had to go and do this diving officer's course, which was at Horsey Island, which is still running. But again, as a throwback to post-war legacy, I don't think it had changed very much since the charioteers had been training there on the clammy death, really, because it was a torpedo range. And the advantage of that to the Navy for diving was it was very long, consistently certain depth, and you could make people run around it a lot. And they had very high jumping boards and lots of little huts. It was miles from anywhere, so nobody could really hear the screams. And it was right adjacent to the up reaches of Portsmouth Harbour, which is where the infamous mud runs were run.
Yeah, I know them. Yeah.
So that was a sort of ideal platform as far as the Navy was concerned to sort of basically weed out anybody that wanted to be a Navy diver.
Yeah,
And
the character building process, if you like.
yeah, which is, yeah, let's call it that for a minute. Yes, that. So, you know, Joe, I got there with my usual sort of enthusiastic, let's get on with this, and I hated it. Absolutely hated it. Cold, miserable, jumping off things. I didn't like heights. Certainly didn't like jumping off heights. Certainly didn't like being in a sort of alien environment like that. It was just for the first 2 weeks, just dreadful. And then all of a sudden, I thought, actually, I quite enjoy this. And then I worked out I was going as a ship's diving officer, which meant as a lowly sub-lieutenant on a frigate with a four-ring captain, he had no idea what the ship's diving team was supposed to do. And nobody else on the ship had any idea what the ship's diving team was supposed to do. And I had this book called BR 2806, which was the Navy sort of diving rule book. And I looked at it and went, I can actually go to the captain. I've got to keep minutes up. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And given our first deployment was to the Far East, that was pretty cool. I mean, I was 21, I think. I had a team of 10, unrestricted diving gear down the back of the frigate, 2 rubber boats with outboards, and a mandate that said I had to keep my team worked up to minutes, as well as doing all the other silliness that we had to do. And off I went, really. It was phenomenal. I mean, we were away for a year. We dived all over the Far East, Philippines, Barrier Reef. First team that had actually gone out to the northern edge off Townsend, because we had to bribe the Australian Air Force to take us out on their crash boat. Philippine diving, you know, I mean, just brilliant, absolutely brilliant for a 21-year-old with a team of guys that were just brilliant blokes, really.
So at the age of 20, at the age of 21, you're in charge of 10 bods. You're making up the rules as you go along. Well, you're abiding by the rule book, but then again, the rules are to be interpreted. So if you hadn't have done that, it would have been the blind leading the blind. So you've come from school not knowing exactly what you wanted to do, except be artistic, which was in direct conflict with your dad. Then your dad came up with the idea that you should join the Navy, right? Well, it was sort of, he came up, it was actually you. And now you've been through your training and all of a sudden you're diving around the world.
Yeah, exactly. And in a job in a frigate with a brilliant captain, brilliant ship's company, doing brilliant stuff, really. I mean, we were doing all sorts of interesting things at the time, deployed. I mean, I've been to Belize, I think, already because of that incursion going back in time. So we were the first ashore there. I was ashore with the Marine detachment and we went in jungle. So we'd already sort of done some interesting stuff before we got to the Far East. And yeah, it was pretty special, really. Again, one of those 2-degree shifts, really. Had I not ended up on that diving aptitude doing that thing and then turned up and then I wouldn't have been in that position at all. And who knows where it would have ended up. But
and quite often it is that a lot of success and failure is down to a decision in the moment. Because I hear people say, "Oh, I've been unlucky," and what have you. And I believe, and probably like you, Kevin, you make your own luck. I think that luck stands for, it's a mnemonic for labour under correct knowledge. And I like the way that you use the word fortunately, fortunate, quite regularly, because I like that word too. I believe that you can get things going in the right way for you at certain times, but you've got to make that happen, haven't you? Because it's the way you react if we go back to the SH1C happens, and when it happens, it's what you do with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I think that that sense of it, you know, we learn, don't we? I mean, we're
Mm.
talking about this sort of much later on from those periods where if you look at a photograph of us, in the early days of joining up, or me as I was then, and you look at it and go, is that the same person?
Yeah.
And it's sort of is and it isn't. It is the same. We are the same person, but with different people. And
Mm.
it's consequential effect. I had to do a lot of learning about myself, really, to go in, to go out. That is that Buddhist thing, isn't it? The only
Yeah,
way
yeah,
out
yeah.
is in. You have to learn about yourself and challenge yourself to make sure that you're the best version. There's no hidden sort of closets or bits of the attic that are dark. You've got to shine lights in these things in order to sort of learn to be the best version that you can be of yourself.
Yeah.
But I learned quite early on. I've had massive successes in life, um, and I've also had some pretty disastrous experiences, near existential experiences. But when you look at any of it, I don't think we could ever claim to be single-handedly responsible solely for any great success in our life, because it's always been as a result of the people and the experiences and the choices around me that have helped me to achieve that, and
Mm.
some amazing people. And similarly, when I look at some of the biggest disasters in my life, whilst I've got a part to play in that, it isn't just my part in it, because of all the other things, people, experiences that were going around it. So
Yeah.
I don't think we're ever single-handedly responsible for any of the greatest thing we've ever achieved. Neither are we single-handedly responsible for any of the biggest disasters that have happened. So there's
No.
always this relationship between people, experiences, and our choices in the end, what we choose to do at that moment,
Yeah.
and then that defines us. So I think that was the other thing I learned
Yeah.
quite a lot.
And my experience as well, and I served with EOD, uh, and you served with EOD as well, didn't you? You were EOD and clearance diver, and I always thought that some of the stuff we had to deal with was pretty hairy, but like doing that underwater brings in a different dynamic, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Um, of course, it's only in retrospect when you're thinking about all this stuff that you sort of try and analyze it. But yeah, because I'd gone from that whole I don't really want to do this stuff, and to become a clearance diving officer at the time. I think it's different now, but you had to have been a ship's diving officer for 2 years, so you'd had to show that you could run the teams, that you had the commitment, and then it was selection. It wasn't an automatic,
No.
so you had to be selected. And then once you were selected, then you crossed through another swing door, because these doors that you go through, you can never go back again. Once you walk through them, you can't
Yeah.
go back. That movement from fleet and all this other stuff into spec war and underwater ops was another swing door that I moved through. And in a way, what I said to you about feeling otherworldly when my mum died, i.e., there was no commonality with folk. In a way, that journey into being content with that, it extended the minute I walked through that door, the minute I went through those swing doors,
Mm.
because it was the next step on. And yeah, I mean, I think Julian Moore, um, there's a book by Roger Groom called The Diver, and
Yeah.
that's about as close to the sort of parallel I could give you to my sort of experiences, because he went through clearance diving, became a sat diver, which isn't the usual pathway. It's probably you count on fingers on one hand, very few people that have followed that path, within the military. So it was again becoming part of this further filtering down of otherworldliness the minute you did it, because the military experience to me was always about what they're looking to do is to ensure they're left with people. The further into that space you get, they're looking for people that not only can do, but they're looking to get rid of the people that can't. So
Yeah,
what they're
yeah.
left with people that can do. So the journey of filtering to get to that point is quite robust, isn't it? And the
Mm.
things that you have to experience. But yeah, once you get into that, and all the things that went with it, well, combat swimming on its own is a thing. I mean, just dumping people in the middle of nowhere, 2 miles off a target in the pitch black, and then giving them a compass board at the time, a depth gauge. So one of them doesn't actually take you so deep, you're going to go into convulsions because of the oxygen, and the other one's carrying the hardware. And between the pair of you, you've got to navigate 2 miles in the dark to a target, is at one extreme of it. And then at the other extreme, 200 feet EOD, work on unknown mines in, pitch black. Plus, climbing up and down oil rigs, falling out of airplanes, whatever they stick in between of it.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's quite a difficult thing to do. Well, in fact, it's very difficult to do.
Because it's so otherworldly, I think I remember going through stuff with the Marines later on. And to be honest, they were honest with me, so we've got no idea what clearance divers do. We just don't know. We don't know what they do, because it's already by default off the grid. It's already off the radar. There's no photographs, there's no movies, there's no books of it, because it's pitch black dark, usually in the most difficult circumstances. So it almost defines itself as being remote in a way. And your teams are small. I mean, even on a mine hunter, when I was 24 at that time, my team for the clearance diving team was 6, maybe.
Yeah.
That's tight, and you've got your senior rate and the lads. That's small. That's a small, tight team of people that are specialists in what they do. So it almost defines you as different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does totally. So when you were working with the US, because you went over to work with them on the experimental diving, and as operation and training officer, what was going on there, and how did you find that took you to a new level?
Again, these confluences, 2-degree shifts. At the time, the Navy, given that the branch was already sort of piratical is not the right word, unconventional, let's put it that way. There was still stuff going on in the branch. It was probably going on, back in World War II, when they were all banging about doing pretty much what they wanted to and blowing things up. So there was a bit of that with it. So then the Navy, somebody in the Navy decided that they needed saturation diving was just banging, starting to kick off commercially. So it was obvious that if we wanted to stay in that space, we had to get that capability to go deeper. And the technologies were evolving and the tables were evolving. So man in the sea, if you like, was starting to become more a case of how deep you could go. So it was obvious the Navy were going to follow that. They'd already been involved in it with the Americans, with Sea Lab in the late 60s. So
Yeah,
there was always an exchange project between the UK and the US, and particularly in that, when you go back through the history of it, there's always been a Brits involved in that project, from Sea Lab through to the Man in the Sea program. There was always Brits on that exchange. So I thought that, well, I got selected for it. Actually, I got told that's what you were going to do, and part of that was that I had to become a saturation diving officer, which at the time there wasn't a program for that to train anybody. So the Navy had a thing called Naval Party 1007, which were a team of randomers on remote, collectively, on a ship taken up from trade, the Seaforth Clansmen, and they were trying to develop and push tables, and that's where we did our training. And that was the first time I ever got bent. Actually, it was on a bounce dive out of a bell. I think we were doing 90-meter bounces on tables that nobody had ever tested. Actually, they sort of making up as they went along. And I thought, oh, blimey, that hurts on the way out, coming
and
up through the.
just for people who don't know what saturation diving is, just give a quick brief.
Yeah, okay. Normal diving, which people are familiar with, probably heard of the bends, and that's because when you're breathing whatever the gas is, you uptake it into your body tissues, and the inert bit, the nitrogen, goes into your tissues, and it sits there, and it's like a fizzy bottle. If you take off the pressure too quick, and it's trying to get back out into the bloodstream to get out, then it fuzzes up and creates bubbles, really, and then those bubbles bends. So saturation diving, they found out that once you're at depth for 24 hours, so you've saturated everything in the body, the time to decompress, to come back again, is the same for 24 hours as it would be theoretically for 24 days. So you live at the pressure in chambers in little sort of capsules, and then get into other little capsules and get in and out, or little submarines and get in and out, but you're living all the time at that depth. So you go to the chamber complex, they'll compress you to whatever your working depth is, and you live at that depth in the chambers until they decompress you and bring you out. So that's saturation diving.
Yeah, and there's quite a few things that can go not to plan, I suppose.
Well, yeah, inevitably. Yes, and especially when they're still making up as they're going along, which is what was going on there.
Which is what you were doing during that, because it was experimental, of course.
Well, when I got to the States after Klansman, because Klansman was still, I'm going to use this term again, it was pirate navy, really, in the best sense, but it was. I mean, anybody central had no idea what they were doing, clearly. So it's pretty much up to the on-site boss as to how that team got run. And then they got jobs given, and then you go and do the job and then go off task. It was the same as being on a clearance diving team. You'd be on job doing whatever they tasked you to do. And when you were off task, that was it. So nobody really knew they sort of knew where you were, but didn't really know what you were doing until you were given the next job. And Klansman was a bit like that.
Yeah.
But when I got to the States, that was a different kettle of fish. I mean, completely different kettle of fish, because EDU, the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, where I got sent, was effectively underwater NASA, really resourced as underwater NASA. It was the central point, not just for sat diving, it was the central hub for every form of service diving that the US Navy were doing. So that was everything from spec war seals, Green Beret, all that stuff, right the way across to saturation, including salvage. So all the arc of everything to do with what they called the Man in the Sea program came through that development center, as well as the tables and everything that went with it. So confluences, I got sent there. I think I was 25 when I got there. And I remember reporting to it, because again, no internet. I mean, I was just trying to glean what I could from brochures and talking to people that had been there, but I had no idea about it. Saw this place, which was, 4-story test diving facility with, huge numbers of chambers inside, about 55,000 gallon wet tank, plus all the test and evaluation labs. Got introduced to the CO, who was very, very welcoming. And he said, right, you're taking over from, I think I took over from a lieutenant commander. I think I was a lieutenant at the time. So I was taken over from a commander and they went, well, there's your office. What? Which office? So they see the corner of that building over there. And it literally was a corner of the entire dive complex. And the job was the ops boss for the entire unit. And that included all the training, all the getting together of the programs, test programs, so my own test stuff. So again, at 25, I just suddenly walked into this job that, probably looking at it, was well beyond my pay grade. But I was just, again, working with the most amazing people in the most amazing place, and they wouldn't let me come home. I mean, I was there in the end for about 4 years, I think. They just wouldn't, because of the things we were doing and the programs we were on. I sort of almost became embedded there, frankly.
And I remember the times I've worked with the Americans, the time capital and skills resources that you've got available are phenomenal. And I can imagine at a centre of excellence for diving, as you put it, the equivalent of the NASA of diving, what you must have had at your disposal
Yeah, I mean,
could only be described as amazing.
well, yeah, it is, and but I suppose to get to that point, there were two things we spoke about earlier about contributing factors to things, right? The thing I had with me at the time in role, so there were two of us. There was me and my warrant officer.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was the difference because the guy I was with, I then subsequently did, a number of things with, Ted Morrison, the most amazing bloke I think I've ever met in my life, really. Experienced, taciturn, Scots guy, warrant officer diver. But it wasn't sufficient that you sort of turned up and he said, well, I'm this, and I'm a clearance diver and we've done this and that, because it meant nothing to them. And the Navy, US Navy way of diving is that it's all vested in the senior rates. There's no officers do anything. Officers are there to sign things, not getting
Yeah.
the boat, not getting the gear. And of course, I'd come from an environment where you lead from the front. So there was none of that nonsense. You shared responsibilities with your senior rate, shared supervising, you got in the water with the lads, you did the jobs. The more difficult the job was, usually you were the one that did it because you wouldn't ask them to do something you wouldn't do. So it was a
Yeah.
different. So we had to go through this whole credibility factor with the Americans to get to a point where they'd even begin to listen to what I had to say, um, let alone do what I asked them to do. So I had to go through that whole cred thing again with them. And that included the spec war people, SEAL teams. So we had to earn that, and we had to do that by doing what, Brits usually do, which is turn up, get on with the job and do it bloody well and just get on with it and then lead by example. And that's essentially what we did. So in the end, yeah, I had a team, my own project team. It was a mixed discipline team. I think I had about 20 that were my team because we'd already started to develop equipment for EOD spec war that was coming back to the UK. So I was the project officer for it and developed a program. And eventually our own jet sitting at Tyndall Air Force Base, which was 20 miles away, I think, with all the gear that we could, boats, workshop stuff, load into the back of this thing and fly anywhere in the world, which we did to deploy it. And that was essentially one of the jobs that I sort of carved out really in the end. And again, some of the people I work with there, the Americans, were just phenomenal. I mean, there was a lot of sort of qualitative issues sometimes, but
Yeah.
the guys that had been in Vietnam, the guys that had been Master Chiefs, EOD techs in the jungle, the Spec War guys with SEAL Team 6, just amazing people. And again, you learn, don't you? And
Yeah.
that, when you talk about privilege to lead people, I've been so privileged to be able to be in a position where they've entrusted me with their faith to lead them.
And
And
talking about trusting you, there was something that you did which was quite groundbreaking, I believe, because wasn't it that you developed the first dive for a female at saturation?
yeah, I think looking back on it, I've spoken to the American commander that was on the outside running it as like from Houston, if you like, while I was team leader on the inside. So I had a team of 20, no, it was as many as that, maybe 12, I think, in the sat dive. And I was the team leader for that because that team was the first team to have a female diver in sat. That was the first time they'd ever done it. And I think it was quite deliberate because I think the CO decided if anybody was going to be able to deal with the mutiny that ensued inside in the sat, it would be me. I think
Right,
I
okay.
put in there to do it. And it was a woman called Sue Trucken that went on to become that. I know we're sort of just chatting, aren't we? This woman, you talk about meeting people. She was 5'2", right?
Right.
So slight, most cheerful lieutenant I think I've ever met, right? But a woman in a, let's put it this way, in a not necessarily all-embracing, empathetic environment for women at that time in the US Navy diving community. It's
Yeah,
different.
I can imagine there's an awful lot of undercurrent with that
But
statement.
she was a pioneer. So when
Yeah,
she qualified, she had to do the same things that the blokes did.
yeah, of
Now, at the
course.
time, they were still using what's called standard gear. Do you remember that old sort of big helmet,
Yeah,
boots,
yeah,
big pots and things? And the weight of that alone, I can't remember exactly how much it weighs, but it was testing to stand up in it, let alone walk
yeah,
and get in. And then to add to that, the Americans had a what was called a mixed gas version of it and a big carbon dioxide scrubber canister that would bolt on the back of the helmet, adding another however many pounds. So she was 5'2", and they made her life misery to get through qualification. I know that because I was there and heard the stories of what they did to try and convince her it wasn't a career choice. So she was already been through that mill by the time this sat dive went down. And yeah, I led the team that had her in it for that first dive, and that was challenging. Inside, it was challenging. I had a few
yeah.
moments in the States where they virtually down tools on me. I had an EOD team down tools on me because they said it was too dangerous. I said, please explain to me what EOD means.
Yeah, what part of EOD are you having
You,
difficulty
you're
understanding?
not quite understanding. You're telling me getting in a rubber boat in a Force 5C in this wind is dangerous. I said, I've got 19-year-olds at home would do this. Please don't. You're embarrassing yourselves. So
Yeah,
literally, I had to sort of garner them back. But that sat dive was challenging, yeah, because they weren't happy inside at all,
yeah.
and
Which
you've got
which
no.
which, which led on to 2 world records, I believe, didn't it?
Yeah, we sat those, and then we did 2 open water world records from there.
And what
Um,
what was that involved with?
that was a piece of equipment that you could. I'd sort of realized there was a piece of kit the Brits were about to buy. The Americans weren't really using to the potential that I knew it could be used to because of the types of diving that we'd done in the UK. And essentially, I just suggested how we could do that and fly it away to remote areas and then bounce out little rubber boats. So I think at the time, 300 meters, I think we did nearly 1,000 feet out of these little rubber boats using this kit. And I wrote the program for it and led the team to do it.
Fabulous. That's pretty deep, that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that is pretty deep. Yeah, definitely. And so once you've done that, I believe you come back to the Royal Navy in the UK, don't you? And you're working with the autonomous saturation dive systems and perfecting that.
Well, perfecting it was a bit of a loose term because when I came back, there'd already been, I think, 2 explosions on it when they were trying to build it. Um, and it was quite challenging because I'd been at the cutting edge of this with the Americans for 4 years and then came back to this debacle. Um, and they were having another go at it, but decided to bring in civilian contractors from the North Sea to do it. So I sort of got there just as they were trying to sort of put all that together. Well, I then was the project officer for that to set it to work, really. So yeah, we did that really, which again was an interesting period. That ship was visionary. It had little sort of unmanned submersibles that would go to, I think it was 5,000 meters, I think was the capability of that.
Mm.
Manned submersibles, saturation diving systems, phenomenal, really. Just I think it was just never quite understood by mod really what it was that they were buying or what it was supposed to do. So it didn't really have a defined purpose, and that was the beginning of the end for it. I think whatever they'd done with it, I think it was always destined to go the way it did.
And at this point in your career, how old are you now?
So I was just coming up to Lieutenant Commander, so I was probably 26, 27 by the time I came back, maybe a bit older.
Right. So now you've got a few experiences under your belt, and in the early 90s, then you're thinking about what's next, aren't you?
I'd sort of, to be frank, I'd sort of seen the writing on the wall in the way the mod went about it. I was quite wide-eyed when I came back from America because it was about the mission and it was funded. I got back. I probably again went into a job above my pay grade, which brought me into contact with mod procurement. And then I sort of saw the writing on the wall. So I was disillusion wasn't right, but I sensed that I wasn't it wasn't really resonating with me. And I was at a juncture in my career where the expectation, because I'd been selected for full career by that time, the expectation was I would sort of step away from the branch and go back into mainstream big navy, and drive ships and go through to become whatever, an admiral, whatever it was. So there was this sort of fork in the road coming up for me, I think, at that point. So that's when I started to think really where I was going with that, frankly.
And meanwhile, you're serving with the intelligence services, aren't you? And doing
Well, yeah,
work.
because of the weirdness of my career path, when it became sent, it seemed like I was thinking about moving. Then they wanted me, so yeah, I did. I think we talked about this. I went
Yeah.
to the Marines bizarrely and ended up doing stuff with the SBS bizarrely. And then yeah, the intelligence side of it, domestic really, anything that involved a lot of this stuff, mainly because of the stuff I've been doing in the States, frankly. And then as I was leaving the service, then I went to the Marine Reserve for a bit as OIC of their SBS thing, but that didn't last very long because they had a defence review, and the primary reason I was there was for underwater work, and they took away that role from the reserve. So I then went as senior officer, port diver branch, Central London, which was the fledgling sort of maritime counter-terrorism bit of what the branch now do. So I was OIC there. So I had a number of sort of interesting postings, I suppose, on the way out the door. But I decided I was going then. I'd had enough by then. I just thought, no, not anymore. So those were the sort of processes of leaving.
Yeah. And interesting at this juncture, I'd like to ask something which I always think is interesting because of the psychology of you. How do you deal with failure?
Oh, not well early on. I mean, I just couldn't assimilate that. I mean, I did. If I thought if I think it, we can make it work, and I can put these together, we'll make it work. So in the early days, my bounce back ability from failure. Well, actually, that's not true. In the military, I was pretty all right with it, really, because if you set out to set an objective, everything's put in place, but there's certain things you can't control. So I didn't really sort of experience failure in that sense, as you'd label it. But I think, as I said, as we sort of talked about earlier, I learned that none of these wonderful things I'd ever achieved were single-handedly me that had done it. It was the people around me, and none of the disasters I'd ever achieved. So what I learned, and there was sort of 3 points, I suppose, when we're talking about this, that you could sort of touch on, is that, you know, I don't really ever see stuff as failure, frankly.
No.
Sounds a bit trite, but I just I don't see it. What's a good example to give you that? I suppose, when we look at seminal things, you heard of Jim Stockdale?
Sorry?
Have you ever heard of Stockdale, Admiral Jim Stockdale?
Yes, yeah, I have.
Yeah. So the Stockdale paradox, if you like, is a pretty good way of looking at that. Is that, shall I just outline the
Yeah,
Stockdale?
please do. Yeah, it's important. Yeah.
Yeah. So this came about because Stockdale was, at the time, I think, lieutenant commander, shot down over Vietnam, got jailed and put into what they called the Hanoi Hilton, which was the
Yeah.
prisoner of war camp. And I think in the time he was there from 65 to 73. He had no rights, no set release date, and certainly no idea whether he'd ever see his family again. I think he was tortured over 20 times during that period. I mean, not great at all. but psychologically, they reckon he came out better than he went in. And so there was an interview that somebody did with him about, I think it was a book called Good to Great. And they said, well, how did you survive that? And he basically said, well, I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted that not only would I get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which in retrospect, I would not change. So already when he set that out, you can go, yeah, okay, so there's a fundamental principle against which you can set. So I've got the skills, resources, and tools to overcome anything that's put in front of me. It's how I choose to approach it. And they then went on to ask him, I said, well, who didn't make it? Um, he said, well, I never lost faith in the end of the story. I would get out. Da-da. The people that didn't, he said, were the optimists, the ones that would keep saying, well, we'll be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would turn up and it would go. And they
Yeah,
would, and they'd say, well, we'll be out by Easter. And then Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving would come and it would come and go. And in the end, they just died of a broken heart. So his point from that was that you should never confuse the faith that you're going to prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline. And this is why this military thing, to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. So this determination that I've got all the skills, resources to use this as an opportunity and turn this into a positive, really. It's simple.
which is similar to the thing that I believe in wholeheartedly, that, when people say about the SMART goals, attainable and relevant or realistic, some people say, a lot of the times when you're setting impossible goals, they're not really realistic. I mean, if we go back to when you were aged 8, you would never look or think of having a dream, if you were capable of it, of what you did when you were an older man throughout your career. So it's about growing into the person that you need to be, I suppose, to achieve that goal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And one of the things you learn is that, as I said earlier, there's no blackboard really. There's no rule book that defines success or failure. That's my perception of success
Yeah.
or failure. Anybody else's. So it's how we choose to graduate what we consider to be success and failure. So if you're approaching life from that point of view, there's a philosopher, Alan Watts, that's responsible for bringing Buddhism into the West. Really interesting
Yeah.
stuff. I mean, he worked as a counselor for youngsters when they said, well, what should we do? What should we do? What am I going to do with my career? What am I going to do? This, that, and the other. And what his view was that all we're doing is training people just to keep making the same shit. Sorry, same
No,
stuff.
no, it's okay, same shit, different day. Yeah. I'm okay with that.
And then what we're doing is then waiting for the day. Well, I've only got to do this to do that, and then I can be happy. I've only got to do this to do that, to do that, to do that, and then I'll be successful. And of course, as we're probably going to go and talk about, that day may never come. So the imperative is to be doing the things you love and with the joy you experience in that, because the money will follow. You are around people that love the same things you do. You're in a community of groups of people that are interested in the same thing. You're getting the joy and fulfillment of what it is, not some point in the future, because it's in the now is where all the experiences are, where that joy is, where these things occur, not 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So I had to learn that. And that Stockdale paradox, there's 3 things I wanted to touch on today. That one, if you use it, learn it, not because he was in Hanoi Hilton, but in terms of life and the storms you've talked about.
Yeah.
What the military gives you is a skill set, and it gives you a toolbox. It's how you choose to use that toolbox,
Yeah, of course it is.
and on the expectation that, as you said, it happens. So it's not, is it going to happen, or when it's going to happen.
How much? How
Yeah.
much is going to happen?
And then when it does, how you're choosing to process it and how you're choosing to move forward from it. So to your question about failure, I'm always careful about language. You know,
Yeah,
when
yeah,
it
yeah.
comes to teaching mindset, language is the most powerful tool we have because it's our story to ourselves. And if
Mm,
we're using the wrong story to ourselves, that is incredibly debilitating. So labeling it as failure, I don't think that's helpful. I don't find that helpful to me. I'm not saying I've got the answers to everything in life, but for me, if
mm,
I start labeling things black and white like that, it doesn't help me because
yeah,
there's nowhere to go from that. If you call it a failure, then that's what it is. And because, you know, whether you can or you can't, you're right. If you
yeah,
believe
yeah,
that,
exactly. Yeah,
once you've said it's a failure, you've labeled it a failure. There's a psychologist called Carol Dweck that's worked a lot with kids on positive psychology. And one of the things that she did, I think it was in Sweden, with kids that weren't performing well, and I think they were ethnic minority kids, if I remember rightly. So they stopped using pass and fail as a mark, right? Like you and I grew up in a world where you either passed or failed, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What they did was simply just change that from pass or to not, and the alternative was not ready yet,
Yeah.
right? It wasn't pass fail; it was just not ready yet. And that simple thing fundamentally started a process of change, which resulted in an uptick in their performance ability because if we label it failure, then that's the story we tell ourselves, and then that's a debilitating negative downward spiral, frankly. And so you're looking to maintain positive upward spirals, and usually the first determination of that is the decision you make in the first couple of
Mm,
seconds of a problem happening, is whether you choose to believe you've got any power and control over it, or whether it's happening to you. And you hear that so much when people say that's winding me up or that's making me angry. No, it isn't. You are. You're
yeah, yeah,
doing it. And now you've got a choice. If you know that, now you know that, then you've got a choice about what you do about it. What do you want to do? Do you want to go into the negative downward spiral cul-de-sac, or do you want to make a choice about changing it? And the minute I find you make that decision, everything changes, even in the worst possible circumstance. Because the first question you ask yourself in what looks like failure, what's my part in this?
mm,
Not what's happening to me, what, you know, the poor me story, what's my part in it? Because that's the bit I've got a degree of control over, and that's the bit I can change. That's the bit I can learn from, and that's the bit I can use going forward as I move forward. So same thing in the military. You know, we're going to talk about the military skill sets. Well, it's not about how well you can keep your kit, is it? It's about your thinking processes.
yeah,
Because if you adopted that, well, we failed. If you were leading a team of guys, and the first thing you said, well, that was a failure, that you wouldn't do it because you're just putting the wrong thing in their heads. You go, okay, well, that was a learning experience, lads. That was an opportunity for
yeah,
growth. Or what do we learn from that? You know, whatever. But you'd never say you're failures, would you?
yeah. Well, you see that's interesting because I know the word failure is bandied around so much. So because I recognize that, I say, look, right, the first thing is you've not failed if you look at what you can do to get better, right? And how you can use that experience to get better. So if that word failure does come on, it may be that it didn't go to plan. Exactly. So I agree entirely with what you're saying. It is about the language. And the most important language for me is the language you use in your own head, the self-taught.
Yeah. Well, then that's it. Because I think when I was teaching this, and I don't know how do I do this. Look, it's simple. You talk to somebody, go, that voice, and they go, what? And you go, yeah, that one, the one that's sitting on your
Mhm.
right shoulder that's talking to you all the time. And they look at you like you've discovered some special secret. No, everybody's got that, you know, that
Uh,
story that you're telling yourself. And the easiest way to break that dissonance, especially if they're parents, so you're hearing that voice, son, yeah. Okay, so we now know that that's what's happening, and you know how it's talking to you. Yeah. So can you just imagine how old are your kids? And they'll go, I don't know, 4 or 5. You go, well, imagine your 5-year-old, sit them down in front of you and now start speaking to them like you're speaking to yourself.
mm,
So would you do it? And inevitably they're going to go, no, of course not. At which point you go, why? Well, because, and there's all the rational reasons
yeah,
why
yeah,
you would
yeah.
a 5-year-old, the way you're talking to yourself, and go, well, right now, and this is always the other one that people struggle with, is who's the most important person in the world right now? And usually they'll trot out my kids, my this, that, and the other. And of course, that's nonsense because the most important person in the world at that moment is you. Because in what you do defines how your kids get on, the happiness in your family, whatever, whatever. So if you're not right, then nobody can be right around you because they love you. And that's what they want for you is to be right.
We,
So if you talk to your kids like that, what on earth are you doing talking to yourself like it?
mm,
So stop it
yeah.
immediately.
Which
And
brings us back to always put your own oxygen mask on first, because if you're not alive, you can't help anyone else. You got to sort your own kit out. You got to sort your own mind processes out, and you've just got to get to grips, really.
yeah, and I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it is but we're not taught that, are we? You know, it's
No,
another
no.
stuff that we're told. Now, I'm not saying everybody should be a narcissistic, selfish. I don't really care because that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying when it comes to it, the most important thing you can do for your
Mm,
family, for the people that work for you, if you're running the business, um, even for the people you're working for, if they're they're good employers, is to be the best version of yourself,
yeah.
right? Because if you're not, and then again you're looking for other reasons outside to, well, it's this and it's that, and it isn't. So it's about developing the deepest possible foundations that you can with no dark arcs of odd behavior and limiting beliefs and all these other things that tend to constrain the way we see the world, the lenses we look through, to have these really deep foundations so that psychological foundations, yeah, physical
Yeah.
foundations, nutrients, because when these storms you're talking about come, they're going to come. And like anything, if you've not got deep foundations, you're just going to blow over and not come back again. Whereas at least if the foundations are deep and this wind storm's blowing, you'll bend and you'll bend back again. It may
Yeah.
take some time, but at least you'll come back. So to me, the foundations we build for ourselves are probably the most important thing. The
Mm.
way.
And recognizing as well, being your best self. If you give 100% on a good day, you might get a better result than if you give 100% on a bad day. So long as you're still giving 100% of what you can do to be your best self, it's also being honest and recognizing that the result may not be as good as another day just because of the outside influences or whatever was going on in that time.
Yeah, and you're right. And then there's sort of tools you can use to do that that get you out of your
Yeah,
head.
yeah,
So you do that. But in principle, you're right. I mean, one of the other dangers, I think, it's a double-edged sword, the military, and the more specialized you get, the more double-edged it becomes.
yeah, it does.
There's a there's a tendency, I think, let's not just say the military, but in life generally, perfectionism. But there's this expectation that everybody can do everything and go beyond and beyond, beyond, and good enough isn't good enough because everybody delivers it. So we live in this environment of expectation and perfectionism. This idea that everything's got to be, bang on all the time. But really, for a perfectionist, 100% isn't good enough, frankly, because even if
No,
they got to 100%, it still wouldn't be good enough. It'd be 120, 130. And what perfectionists tend to miss is all the things that have happened at 70, 80, and 90% that they've achieved that contribute to their overall success. So it's never about 100% success. It's about the journeys of what we've achieved along the way. And if we don't validate that, if we don't step back from the wall, if you like, if you in a way, life's a bit like a blackboard, isn't it? You got all these
mm,
things you got to do, and we stand with this nose right up against the board, and then wonder why we don't have any perspective. So disciplining to be able to take 3 or 4 paces back, whether that's through journaling or whether that's through talking to a mentor or finding another way of looking at it. If we don't find a way of stepping back from the blackboard, we've got no perspective. So we
no.
don't see
Mm.
things we're achieving because we're so bothered about the things we're not achieving. And it becomes a very negative downward spiral in that sense. So these and this isn't magic, Joe. You know this. These are skills.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
just happens that in the military they'll teach you lots and lots and lots of skills. All we're talking about here is thinking skills.
Yeah.
right? So it's not magic. It's not some, oh, I've got to read another self-help book to get an answer on this. They're basic fundamental principles and skill sets that you can learn and practice.
Mm. And you know, life's a roller coaster, and you've had your downs. When you get the successes, how do you deal with it? What recognition do you give to accept that you've had success, and how does it manifest itself?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I'm still guilty in a way of just assuming that that just goes with the territory. That's what I'm supposed to do. So I'm supposed to over deliver, supposed to achieve these things. And I've had to learn to do what we've just suggested, which is step back, not to, you know, shout it from the rooftops. I don't do social media particularly. I don't
No.
find it a very I don't know, helpful channel. Let's put it that way. I don't sort of yada yada about stuff. I suppose that's a bit old school, even when I was doing the I mean, these days you can't. What I say, you can't you can't turn around without falling over somebody that's been in special this, that, or the other in the British military right now. I think if you count out all the people I've met that have been involved in all that stuff, it probably outstrips the whole bearing of most of the forces, frankly. So that whole process of I'm this, I'm that, I'm that, and the other wasn't part of the culture when I was doing it,
Yeah.
frankly. But there was a reason it was called special, and that's because you didn't go around telling everybody.
And I find, because that's interesting, because I find that there are people who are morning people and people who are afternoon, or people who are evening people. And like, you get all these motivators who are saying, oh, I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I went to the gym and this, that, and the other. And actually they're spending a whole hour or two on social media typing up what they're doing, instead of just thinking, oh, well, let's just get on with it. Because there are people who function better at different times of the day, aren't there?
Well, yeah, it goes back to that sense that I had that everybody's looking for the magic answer. Everybody's looking for the shortcut. If I only read this book, then I'll have an answer. If I do this course, I'll have an answer. If I talk to this influencer, if I talk to this entrepreneur accelerator, if I give this guy, I'm going to get an answer. And of course, I'm not sure that's credible, frankly.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the way it works. It's about a journey of learning and assimilating, and it's about the journey of it. There isn't an answer. There's not one answer, and everybody's looking for that. And I say everybody, a vast majority of the
Yeah.
people that seem to believe that what they're seeing on Facebook with you've only got to do this to do that to do the other, and then you're going to be this. It's still external. You're still looking for externalities rather than looking inwardly to sort your own stuff out
Yeah.
very best you can and get your own lenses cleaned up and then make a decision about which one is, which one isn't, you know,
And which brings me on to, we're sort of leading into this about coaching and mentoring, right? Because you've become an immediate overnight success, like within 24 hours, haven't you? Without a coach or a mentor, or not being given a kick up the bum or an arm around the shoulder at any time whatsoever. So, on a serious note, how important do you think surrounding yourself with good people who at times can do that for you and offer that coaching skill or mentoring?
oh gosh, I mean, it's fundamental, isn't it? For lots of reasons, not just again because they're going to give you a magic answer. And why do I say that? Well, because in our whole history of cult, no, I'm not talking about our sort of national history. I'm talking about us as human beings. The fundamental principles of learning and sages and wise old people who are there to be able to navigate and help you are part of the whole process of the life journey. And you only have to look at any film, right? I think it was Jung talks about this wise old man archetype.
Right, yeah.
That in any film that you see, there's always someone that is there to help the protagonist, the hero of that journey, help them navigate a period to guide them until such time as they've learned and can do it for themselves. So it's not to provide an answer to them, it's to be able to be the navigator, if you like, the pilot of that.
Mm.
Of that. So it's fundamental. You know, the Obi-Wan Kenobi or Karate Kid, you know, left on right off, that stuff. There's always a role.
Great films, yeah.
Or Star Wars, Good Will Hunting. You know, all those types of films has always got at the center of it this sort of sage with great foresight who gives measured advice and guidance, who helps the hero in the quest while letting the hero choose. And this is again back to choice, his own path to destiny or her own path to destiny. So that bit of that is fundamental. And we talked about this with, you know, warrant officers or color sergeants or within the military context. It's equally applicable outside. And I think the second point is that I was shared quite early on, somebody shared this one with me, is that what you want is to look at the people you admire, look at the people who represent the type of person you want to be, that reflect that, and not just whether they've got money or not or success, the type of people that they are and their successes, and then mirror them, be around them, find a way to talk to them, find a way to learn from them, and also hang out with people like that. So you're effectively mirroring those patterns of behavior, and the probabilities are that you'll start to align and move towards that outcome. So that's another value of being in those sorts of groups. So not just, you know, the Facebook, you know, do this, that, and the other, and you'll be living in Bali with swimming pools. I'm talking about the real people, the real people. So even it's not a complex thing, because you can look at what is the commonality with these people and who do I want to be hanging out with?
Yeah.
Look at it like that. Who do I want to be hanging out with? And you'll find the right group to be aligned to. And then that's it. And if you're doing things that are reflective of what they're doing because you share interest in it, so much the better. If you're doing things because they're joyous to you, so much the better. And the rest of it will tend to align around it. So to your question, I think it's critical. Otherwise, how do we learn anything?
Yeah. Because I remember when I look at my military career or business career, I can always, I just look at, because you get clicks, groups that are, so when you look at the group and what they're performing, and if they're overperforming, then the people in that group tend to be overperformers. And then if there's another group that are always whinging, then they tend to be the underperformers. So it's about choosing the group that you also hang around with as well, and where you're getting your influence, whether that's positive or negative, because that'll have a massive effect on the way you perform.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that at all.
So on that subject, because we're coming to the end now, and I know we could carry on for days talking. What's the one tip you will give to someone who's leaving the military or has left the military, is either performing at the top of the career or not? And then I want to talk about what's your future as well. So what's the one tip you give?
Oh, okay. That's massively difficult. So I did try and sort of condense this down. Let me try and put it back to you. Let me reflect it back to you. Right, key. Okay, so everything we can lose everything, right? Right. So shit happens. We've talked about this. Stuff happens. We can lose everything. But there's one thing that nobody can ever take from you. And this is a guy called Viktor Frankl that was in a concentration camp. His entire family wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, went on to write a variant of psychology called logotherapy. But he survived, right? He came out of it, the worst possible circumstance you could ever imagine, when other people had given up, or, you know. So to live in that, if you sort of get a sense of it, and what his belief was that what nobody can take away from you is to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose your own way, you know. And happiness cannot be pursued, or success can't be. It's got to ensue. So life's never made unbearable by circumstances. And this is the point. It's only by lack of meaning and purpose. And Nietzsche says this, you know, you can endure any sorts of how, as long as you have a why.
Mm,
So
mm.
purpose, vocation, what is the purpose? What are you doing? What's your objectives? And if you haven't got that, then nothing really ever will align to it. So, and we put that off in a way. A lot of us, we keep deferring it. It's what Jung called obligations of fulfillment. We can always find obligations to avoid answering that question, because without the purpose, there is no pole star. There's nothing to navigate by. And the purpose is the direction of travel that we're on. And all these goals that we set for ourselves are simply waypoints or stop points along the way. So
Yeah.
if you have a purpose, then you're lost. So I think if I said there's one thing, that will be it. The Frankel, you've got the power of choice about what
Yeah.
you do, and nobody can take that away from you. And that can be good choices or bad choices. But actually, when you make them, you don't know whether they're good or bad. You're making the best judgment you can given the circumstances at the time. And sometimes it's only could be years later when you look back at it and go, well, if that hadn't have happened, that wouldn't have happened. So what seemed to be bad when it happened wasn't bad at all.
No.
So I think that's probably the one that I would give you as a sort of anchoring point.
Thank you. And it's the same as decisions. There's no wrong decision. It's the decision you make with the information you have at that time. And then, as you say, looking back and reflecting on it, then you're looking at in different circumstances with hindsight, because hindsight's a wonderful tool. You may have thought that a different outcome could have been achieved with a different decision.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about the recent stuff. So, all these things that happened are part of the tapestry of things.
Mm.
And, the people have a habit of confusing self-worth and net worth. That
Yeah.
self-worth has nothing to do with all money does is give you choices. It doesn't
Yeah.
give you happiness.
Yeah.
And there's, the last 2 years, what did we talk about? I've had 2 strokes, come back. I've now got cancer. I'm working on reducing that. I haven't sort of taken a view that says, oh, well, that's disastrous or anything. It is what it is. It's another one of the storms I can deal with. There's a Buddhist, I'll leave you on this one. There's a thing called the 5 remembrances, which is the other thing I've learned along the journey. And it's quite straightforward. I'm of the nature to grow old, right? I can't escape old age. We're all going to face that. We all seem to think life is somehow permanent, and it isn't. It's impermanent, and you never know when. I'm of the nature to grow ill. I can't escape sickness. And also, we're all of the nature to die, and you can't escape that either, whatever anybody's saying right now. And the other thing is that I'll be separated from everything and everyone that I've ever held dear. And I've got no control over that. That's
Mm.
just life. My only possessions in all of this, in all of the things we've spoken about, are my actions. And that's the ground on which I stand. So that of all the things that I've learned, it's about what I do and the choices I make that define the outcomes, not anybody else.
Thank you. And it would be remiss of me not to ask this question, because we're not just going to end without looking at your civilian career. Because if we go back now to when you've been working with the intelligence services, SBS, the Special Boat Service, you've been doing quite a bit behind the scenes and developing what is now known as the counter-terrorism branch. When you decided you wanted to get out, what was transition to Civvy Street? Because you were pretty indoctrinated by this time, weren't you? What was your transition like? What challenges did you face, and how did you buffer it around? What was buffering around between different careers in your mind?
I find ironically, I went back to work with my dad.
Right.
Which didn't go that well, I have to say. After all that palaver, within 2 years, I was out of a job because his business went bust
Oh,
and
I'm sorry.
lost. Oh, well, I mean, that was his decision, it's not mine. And I had a young family and a mortgage, and I had to sort of think about what I was going to do. So I had to reboot, start again. And I didn't look back either. I didn't look back to the military. What I realized was that anything I thought code, integrity, the framework, the glue that had bound me in the jobs that I was in had some currency. but it would be a bit silly to assume that that was universal with other people. And that was probably the most difficult transition to get my head around, is to make that adjustment between working with and doing things with people that were the best people in the world at what they did. You didn't really have to look behind you at all. You know, once made a decision, you got on, you did it, and the focus was on the outcome. That wasn't the same codex that I was dealing with once I came out.
Uh,
So I had to sort of reboot. And ironically, along that journey, albeit I didn't go back to theatrical design, design was very much part of the agency that I created, the PR agency, the comms agency. Design production was an intrinsic part of that. And it's formed an element, quite a significant element of everything I've done with consultancies and helping people with businesses and brands. It's always been there. So that bit has come back again, if you like, in a way. So it never went away. I've just sort of, it's just reassimilated it.
That's great, because after you set up the founder of the Wright Partnership, working with some major clients like Warner Brothers, Buena Vista, Disney, with the Power Rangers, then you moved on to going to the States in Buffalo.
Yeah.
And how did that go over in the United States of America?
I think I loved it. I loved paddling my own canoe. I mean, as much as I loved having the agency, the ability to, the diversity of things that I've done in different projects, working with different people, and that richness of experience of working with some amazing people in different places, has enriched so much of what I've done. And I, again, we've used this word fortunate. Those experiences have been invaluable to me, not just in, you know, paying the bills or whatever, but the things that we've done and the things that we've set out to do, this sort of opportunity to be part of things, has been phenomenal. And that spanned so much, really, in terms of different businesses, different products,
Yeah.
different countries. And that's been joyous in a way. We talked about following your joy. I've been fortunate enough to be able to do things that have given me immense joy in that process. Yes, it's been difficult at times because, you know, economic downturns, losses, divorces, illnesses, you know, all the stuff we spoke about at the beginning. But filter all that out, the rest of it is joyous, really. It's joyous.
And something you do mention, that 70% of the planet is covered by water,
Yeah.
and you spent most of your life in it, literally. And one of the things, you were a diving instructor, PADI instructor, and I can say, if I wanted to learn to dive, well, I can dive anyway, but if I wanted to learn, I've never dived before, I would certainly want an instructor with your experience, because I reckon there's a little bit that you can teach someone about diving, isn't there?
We were teaching kids, that's when I set the school up. That was primarily what we wanted to do. I'd come back from America and we'd done interviews around, I think I've interviewed, so divers like I interviewed an outfit called the Black Scuba Divers of America that were taking kids out of Harlem, and they were putting them on boats and taking them out and teaching them to dive. And the guy that was running said, this experience for these kids is life-changing. Might seem simple to you, but it's life-changing.
Yeah.
When we did it, I was interested in how you could use that journey, because once you're at sea, it's a brilliant sort of landscape to be able to talk to people about their mindset and their opportunities in life, not in a patronizing way, but as a mechanism. And when we did the school, it was primarily to get kids engaged with the ocean. And diving, to me, in that sense, was simply the means to be able to get into that world. It was the transport mechanism to get into it. So it was as much teaching the methodologies of it, but it was then about what you did and how you experienced things when you got there. So that experience, I suppose, was governed around that. And funnily enough, the warrant officer I spoke to you about worked with me in the early days. That's what we did. And again, it was very successful. We were able to tap into something that nobody had been thinking about and doing at the time, and do it in ways that were very unmilitary, really. The organization was fundamentally the military bit, but the actual manner in which we taught or encouraged were all the very best things we'd learned about how you teach and
Mm.
empower people to do stuff. And that was the start of that whole mindset thing. So again, that was a privilege, really. I mean, to be able to do that and to bring that knowledge to a bunch of kids that otherwise wouldn't have ever known about it or done it.
And thank you for that. And you mentioned, and you shared with, and I don't want to just skip over it, that you've had health issues. How have you dealt with that when you got the news?
Um, the strokes were a bit more straightforward because I sort of did what I normally do, research it, get some substantive evidence behind it, work out what I could do. Again, not what the NHS could do for me, but what
Yeah,
my part in it was, what I could actually take charge of and approach that. So I came back from two. And again, it was only when I was walking through the stroke clinic to get another CT scan, I realized how close I'd come to not walking away from it. So
yeah,
I suppose valuing things a bit more. And I just sort of did that, got back up. Cancer is a bit different, really, because, we're all, the minute you put a C word in anything,
yeah,
that's cataclysmic to most people. And it's not a sort of benign cancer. So that took a bit of recalibration, I suppose. The realization that there are certainly some things you're not going to think your way out of,
yeah,
I
yeah.
suppose. That sort of, and the imminence of, this. I mean, you're in EOD. I mean, I think there's a sort of existential death wish, frankly. People do that.
Yeah, I
It's
know,
not,
I know where you're coming from with that one.
it's
Yeah,
not normal. I mean, you only have to look at the Hurt Locker to realize it's not normal to
yeah,
do
yeah.
that.
Good
But
film,
you,
good film. Yeah,
but you dance on the edge, and that I suppose there's a lot to do with it. You're dancing on the edge. You're controlling it to a point that you can, and beyond that, you don't have control. So you dance, and diving extremes is the same. Combat swimming is the same. It's not
yeah.
rational. No, nobody in their right mind does it. So there's an element of that dancing at the edge. So you're familiar with it.
Mm,
But then, of course, the imperative of valuing. So when I said to you about value minutes, the cancer brings now is that accelerated realization that life is impermanent and that we have what we have, and it's up to us to do with what we've got. So I've approached that in much the same way. I mean, I've carried on working to help this latest project inventor get his funding and get his brand sorted out, which we've done. And I feel content that I've delivered what I said I would for him. So now I need to get better. I need to address what I was doing. I made a lot of progress in it, but I didn't single-mindedly make cancer the thing, which I'm going to do. I'm going to do now.
thank you for sharing that. And I recognise that the eventual date with the Grim Reaper. We do our best to prolong the journey, I suppose, and make life as good as it can be. So on that, what you just mentioned about the working with the inventor currently, what's the future hold for you now?
Um, I've got. I think the frustration with all of these things is there's so much still to do and experience. Not, oh, I've got to make this, that, and the other. There's so many other things to experience. So I've got a very clear view about the learning processes in teaching, some of which we've talked about upskilling younger people with the thinking skills and resources so they don't have to necessarily battle their way through anxiety, depression, that there are skills that you can teach. So that's very much part of the SEED project. So I'd like very much to sort of put that in place. Because of the things I do, there's other areas of people that have already asked me, will I help them with some of the evolving their projects? So these days, my filter is I tend to help people that have got purpose, entrepreneurs that have got a project that have got a social purpose or outcomes that you could say were positive, and I can lend my support or help to making that successful with them. And then, yeah, the mindset coaching kids, well-being stuff is still very much front and center of what I want to do. So
Fantastic.
that's coming up. Yeah.
And how can people get in touch with you?
I think the easiest way is through the LinkedIn right now, through my LinkedIn profile, Kevin Wright. We're doing quite a lot on the water and sustainability front. So I've been doing quite a lot of articles. We've got quite a lot going on in terms of positioning that. So I think LinkedIn's the easiest way. And it'll give a bit of a sense of what I'm about, really, the page.
Yeah, because there's an awful lot more detail on there, some of which we've not even touched on really. So listen, Kevin, thank you very much for your service to our country. Thank you so much for the service to the community, and thank you for giving me your time spending today sharing your experience, knowledge and wisdom.
Oh, Joe, thank you. It's been a joy, and thanks very much for getting me involved in it. You do a great job.
Thank you. And if you've enjoyed this, well, you can always log on to joeteams.com, joeteams.com, to learn more about the resources and helpful stuff that you can get your hands on. And until we speak again, have a brilliant day. Thank you.